I didn't wake up in pain. I woke up confused. The ceiling was white. Not hospital movie white, real white. The kind that's been repainted so many times it looks like it's holding its breath. There was a soft beep somewhere to my left, steady and patient, like it had nothing urgent to say to me. For a few seconds I couldn't remember my name. That happens sometimes when you come out of anesthesia, they told me later. Your brain is rebooting, like an old laptop that's been pushed too hard. But there was something else in my chest, a heaviness that had nothing to do with surgery. It was a feeling I'd never had before. It felt like something had already gone wrong. I blinked, slowly, like my eyes were moving through syrup. My mouth was dry. My arms were heavy. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm plastic, that weird mix that never really leaves hospitals no matter how many windows they open. I turned my head. Empty chair. That was the first thing that didn't make sense, because my wife had promised me she'd be there when I woke up. Not just promised, insisted. She'd squeezed my hand before they rolled me into the operating room and said, "I'll be right here when you open your eyes. First face you see, okay?" I'd laughed nervously and said something dumb like, "Don't let me wake up alone." And now here I was, awake, alone. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe she'd stepped out to get coffee. Maybe the nurse sent her away for a minute. Hospitals are always doing that, controlling who's allowed in, when, and for how long, like they're guarding secrets instead of sick people. A nurse came in a few minutes later. She had kind eyes, the kind that don't rush you even when the shift is too long. "Hey there," she said softly, "welcome back." I tried to speak but only air came out. She noticed immediately, brought me a little sponge on a stick. Let me wet my mouth. I croaked out my wife's name. She stepped out earlier. The nurse said, she said she'd be back. That should have reassured me. It didn't. There was a faint pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with healing. It was instinct. The same instinct that makes you check your pocket when you feel like something's missing, even before you know what. After she left, I reached for my phone. It was on the side table, face down, charging. I remember thinking how strange it was that nobody had put it closer to my hand, like they usually do. I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy, nerves still half asleep. The screen lit up. No missed calls. No messages. That alone was weird. My wife texts constantly. Updates, emojis, random thoughts, half-finished sentences. Even when we're in the same house, she texts instead of walking into the room. But now, nothing. Not a single "how are you feeling" or "I'm outside." Then I saw the notification from my bank app. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream. It didn't flash red. It was just a normal push alert. Balance update available. I tapped it without thinking, the way you do when you expect everything to look the same as it always has. The app loaded slowly. Hospital Wi-Fi, probably. That little spinning circle felt louder than the heart monitor in the corner of the room. And then the number appeared. I stared at it. Then I closed the app. Then I opened it again. Because my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. My retirement account. The one I'd been building for over 20 years. The one I checked every few months just to feel safe. Just to remind myself that no matter what went wrong in life, I wouldn't be eating noodles at 70, was empty. Not low, not reduced, zero. A neat, impossible zero where a six-figure number used to live. I felt the room tilt, like someone had quietly unbolted the floor. I refreshed the screen. Again, and again, same number. My hands started shaking, but in a slow, distant way, like they belonged to someone else. I wasn't panicking yet. Panic requires certainty. I was still searching for a mistake, a glitch, a display error, a delayed update, anything that would let this be unreal. Another alert slid down from the top of my screen. Transfer completed. No context, no comfort, just confirmation. I tried to sit up too fast and immediately regretted it. The world blurred. My heart started pounding like it had just remembered it had a job to do. I lay back down, breathing through my nose, forcing myself not to pass out, because I knew if I lost consciousness now, I might wake up to something even worse. That's when my wife walked in. She was holding a paper cup of coffee, and her phone in the same hand, talking into her Bluetooth like she hadn't just walked into the most important room of her life. She saw me looking at her. She ended the call. Her face didn't light up with relief. It froze. Not guilt exactly, not fear. Calculation. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Not "are you okay?" Not "I'm here." Not I was so worried. How are you feeling? I lifted my phone. My voice was still weak, but it carried just fine. Why does my retirement say 0? She didn't rush to me. She didn't grab my hand. She set the coffee down on the counter slowly, like the room was suddenly made of glass. It's temporary, she said. That was it. No explanation. No apology. No panic. Just it's temporary. Something inside me went cold. Not angry, not yet. Cold is quieter than anger. Cold is what comes before it. What do you mean temporary? I asked. She waved her hand vaguely, like brushing away smoke. I had to move some money around. Just for a little while. You know I'm good with finances. I stared at her. This woman had once cried because she overdrew the checking account by $30 at Target. You moved all of it, I said. She shrugged. It'll be back. Relax. You're stressing yourself out right after surgery. That's when I realized she wasn't worried about the money. She was worried about me noticing it. I lay there listening to the heart monitor beep. Every sound suddenly too loud, too close, too real. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just nodded slowly and said, okay, because something had changed. And deep down, before I even knew what I was going to do, I understood one thing with terrifying clarity. I hadn't just woken up from surgery. I'd woken up inside a crime. If you're listening to this and you've ever trusted someone with your future, drop a comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. After she said it, after that soft, careless, it's temporary, something broke in the room that nobody else could hear. We sat there in silence, the two of us pretending nothing had happened, like people do when they don't know which lie to use yet. She busied herself with tiny tasks, straightening the blanket, tapping her phone, asking the nurse questions she already knew the answers to, while I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying her words in my head. Temporary. That word is a magician's scarf. You pull it out when you don't want people looking at your hands. A little later, she kissed my forehead and said she needed to go home and grab a few things. Pajamas, toiletries, chargers, all the normal stuff you collect after surgery. She said she'd be back in an hour. I nodded again, and the moment the door closed behind her, I stopped pretending. I didn't call her, I didn't text her. I opened my banking app again. This time, I didn't look at the balance. I went straight to the transaction history. There it was, one clean sweep. Not dozens of small withdrawals, not something accidental. One transfer large enough to empty a lifetime. The destination account had a name I didn't recognize. Not ours, not any of the joint accounts, not any of the familiar investment platforms. It was like someone had reached into my future and vacuumed it. I tried to breathe slowly, the way the nurses had told me to, but my heart wasn't interested in instructions. Every beep from the monitor felt like it was counting down something I couldn't see. Then I checked my email. There were security alerts I'd never received before. Password change confirmations. Login notifications from a device I didn't own, in a city I hadn't been to in years, and the timestamp on all of it. While I was in surgery. While I was unconscious, my phone locked in a drawer. My signature unavailable. My voice literally cut off from the world. Someone had dismantled my financial life with surgical precision. I realized then why she hadn't been in the room when I woke up. She wasn't grabbing coffee. She was finishing the job. The next hour passed like a bad dream. Nurses came in and out, cheerful, efficient, unaware that my body wasn't the only thing that had been opened that day. Every time the door moved, I half expected her to walk back in smiling, ready to reassure me again. She didn't. She texted me instead. Running late, traffic is crazy, rest up. That heart emoji landed like an insult. I didn't reply. I spent the afternoon reading through statements I'd never really paid attention to before. I traced the pattern backward, tiny changes over months, little adjustments in access permissions, the quiet shifting of control from me to her. This wasn't a moment of desperation. It was a campaign. By evening, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with anesthesia. It's amazing how heavy the truth becomes when it finally decides to sit on your chest. She came back after dark, smelling faintly of perfume she only wore when she was trying to impress someone. She set the bag down, gave me a bright smile and said, "See, I told you I'd be back." I didn't smile. I asked her one question. Which account did you send it to? She blinked. Not a long blink, a fraction of a second. But I saw it. The mental filing cabinet opening, the folders shuffling, the calculation of how much I knew. Why does that matter? She said. Because it's my money, I replied quietly. She crossed her arms. Defensive posture my brain supplied automatically. Funny what you notice when you finally stop trusting. You're being dramatic, she said. I already told you it's temporary. We had a chance to invest in something big. I didn't want to stress you before surgery, that's all. I watched her carefully. She was good at this. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't dart away. She sounded reasonable, like the adult in the room. So tell me, I said, what's the name on the account? She sighed, exaggerated, like I was a stubborn child. I don't remember it off the top of my head. You moved everything I've saved for 20 years, I said, still calm, still flat. But you don't remember where you put it. Her jaw tightened. That was the second crack. The first was the empty chair. The second was that silence. We didn't argue, we just stopped talking. She sat there scrolling through her phone, while I stared at the wall, and for the first time in our marriage I saw her clearly, not as my wife, not as my partner, but as someone who had made a decision that no apology could unmake. That night, after she fell asleep in the chair beside my bed, I used the hospital Wi-Fi and my shaky hands to book a consultation with a forensic accountant. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet. I just knew one thing. If she'd been brave enough to steal from me while I was unconscious, then I was going to be brave enough to find out exactly how. The forensic accountant's office didn't look like a crime scene. That bothered me. I'd imagined dark rooms, giant monitors, people in gloves whispering in corners. Instead, 2 weeks after I left the hospital, I was sitting in a place that smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon disinfectant, watching dust float through a beam of late afternoon light like nothing in the world had changed. My wife had driven me there. That part still amazes me. She chatted the whole way, complaining about traffic, about how unfair it was that her job was so underappreciated, about a neighbor who kept parking too close to our driveway. Not one word about the money. Not one slip. It was like she'd filed it away under things we don't acknowledge out loud. The accountant, a calm woman with silver streaks in her hair and eyes that missed nothing, shook our hands and invited us into a small conference room. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" she said. My wife answered first. It was a beautiful performance. She talked about restructuring, about optimizing assets, about timing the market. She used words like they were shields. When she was done, she smiled, the way people do when they think they've just been very convincing. The accountant turned to me. "And you?" she asked. I slid my phone across the table. "I woke up from surgery, and my retirement was gone," I said. "That's what's going on." Silence filled the room. The good kind. The kind that means someone is finally paying attention. The accountant nodded slowly and began asking questions. Not emotional ones, mechanical ones. Who had access to the accounts? When were the passwords last changed? Had I ever signed anything authorizing large transfers? My wife answered smoothly until the questions became too precise. Then she began deflecting. "It's all online now," she said lightly. "These apps are confusing. Anyone can misread a statement." But the accountant wasn't arguing. She was mapping. At the end of the meeting, she asked for copies of everything. Statements, emails, notifications, devices. She asked for time. As we walked back to the car, my wife squeezed my arm. "See," she said brightly, "this will clear everything up." I looked at her and wondered how long she'd been practicing that line. The report didn't come back quickly. It came back carefully. Every few days the accountant emailed another set of findings. Little things at first. Inconsistencies, mismatched authorizations, patterns that didn't fit. Then the language changed. Instead of anomalies, she started using words like unauthorized access. Instead of misalignment, she wrote deliberate concealment. The night the final report arrived, I opened it alone in my home office. My wife was in the living room watching a reality show, laughing at people she'd never meet. The document was 40 pages long. I didn't read it all at once. I couldn't. It felt like trying to drink a lake. The accountant had reconstructed the theft down to the minute. Login times, IP addresses, device fingerprints. She'd charted the movement of funds through intermediary accounts, each one created under variations of my wife's name, misspelled just enough to slip past casual scrutiny. There were screenshots, flowcharts. And then there was the conclusion. The funds were transferred without the account holder's consent during a period of documented medical incapacity, using credentials altered by a secondary user, my wife. Not a mistake, not a gamble, a theft planned around my vulnerability. I heard her laughter from the other room and felt something inside me rearrange itself. It wasn't rage yet. It was resolution, the calm, terrifying clarity that comes when a door closes behind you. I didn't confront her. I printed the report. I made 3 copies, and the next morning I walked into a courthouse I'd never imagined I'd need and asked the clerk how to file for an emergency financial injunction. 2 days later, the judge reviewed the evidence. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't insult her. I let the numbers speak. Numbers are terrible liars. They remember everything. The judge's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the report, lingering on the timestamps. "This transfer occurred while you were under anesthesia," she asked. "Yes, Your Honor. And the destination accounts are in your wife's name?" "Yes." The courtroom was quiet in the way rooms get when gravity changes. The judge leaned back in her chair, tapped the edge of the report once, and said, "I'm issuing an immediate freeze on every account bearing the respondent's name or associated aliases." Just like that. A sentence that took less than 10 seconds to say. A sentence that reached through wires and servers and balances and stopped my wife's world mid-motion. I went home alone that afternoon. She didn't know yet. She found out at 8:17 p.m., when her phone stopped letting her buy dinner. She called me 42 times that night. I didn't answer a single one. The silence after I stopped answering her calls wasn't peaceful. It was radioactive. I didn't turn my phone off. I left it on the nightstand, screen up, volume high, and watched it light up again and again like a trapped insect beating itself against glass. Call after call, missed call after missed call. At first they came in tight clusters, 5 in a row, a pause, then another burst, like she still believed I'd eventually pick up if she just tried the right rhythm. Then the gaps grew longer, the pattern breaking down into something closer to panic. She didn't text at first. That told me more than anything else. Texting would have required thinking. It would have forced her to choose words, and words have a way of becoming evidence. When the texts finally came, they were scattered, unedited pieces of her internal monologue. "My card isn't working. Is your phone broken? This isn't funny. What did you do? I can't access anything." I didn't reply. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house breathe, the refrigerator clicking on and off, the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the distant bark of a dog in the neighborhood. The same house we'd bought together, the same walls we'd painted on a Saturday afternoon while arguing about shades of white. She came home after midnight. I didn't hear the door open. I heard the bags hit the floor. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She walked straight into the bedroom like she'd rehearsed it, stopped a few feet from the bed and said my name, not gently, sharply, like a demand. I didn't move. "I know you're awake," she said. "My phone shows the calls going through." I rolled onto my side and looked at her. In the faint glow from the streetlight outside, her face looked different. Smaller. Less sure of itself. She wasn't holding her phone anymore. She was gripping it, knuckles pale, as if the device had personally betrayed her. "My card declined at the restaurant," she said. "Every card. Even the ones you don't know about." I said nothing. She took a step closer. "What did you do?" The question wasn't angry. It was frightened. That's when I understood how completely the judge's order had changed the air in the room. Nothing had been taken from her physically. No handcuffs, no raised voices, no public spectacle, just access, just the quiet disappearance of a privilege she'd mistaken for permanence. "I followed the evidence," I said finally. She laughed, once, too loud. "You froze my accounts?" she said. "Are you out of your mind? You can't just—" "I didn't," I said. "The court did." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You went to court?" she whispered. I sat up slowly, carefully. My body still wasn't fully healed, but I needed to be upright for this. "I hired a forensic accountant," I said. "They traced everything. The transfers, the aliases, the devices you used while I was unconscious." Her face drained of color in a way that makeup can't hide. "That report is 40 pages long," I added. "It reads like a map of every step you took to make sure I wouldn't notice until it was too late." She dropped onto the edge of the bed. "I was going to put it back," she said weakly. "I just needed time. That's not what the timestamps say." Her shoulders slumped. Not in defeat, in calculation. She was already trying to figure out the next angle, the next story, the next version of reality she could sell. "You humiliated me," she said. "I couldn't even pay for dinner. Do you know how that looked?" I stared at her. Not at the woman I'd married. At the person sitting in front of me. "You emptied my retirement while I was in surgery," I said quietly. "And you're worried about how dinner looked." The room went still. Even the fan seemed to hold its breath. She stood up abruptly and began pacing, rubbing her temples. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," she said. "Everything fell on me while you were sick. I was managing everything alone." "You weren't managing," I replied. "You were extracting." She turned on me, eyes flashing. "So what now?" she snapped. "You think you're some kind of hero? You just destroyed my life over paperwork." "No," I said. "You destroyed your own life when you decided I didn't deserve to know what was happening to my future." The words landed harder than I expected. She stared at me as if I'd slapped her. She tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. "Unfreeze them," she said, "please. I can't even buy gas." I shook my head. "That's not how it works anymore." She slid down against the wall and sat on the floor, her phone lighting up her face from below like a ghost story. That was the moment. Not when she cried, not when she begged, but when she realized that the systems she'd learned to manipulate were no longer listening to her. She stayed there for a long time after I lay back down. I didn't sleep. I watched the ceiling and thought about the strange shape of trust, how invisible it is until it's removed, and then suddenly everything collapses into the space it used to occupy. At 3:12 a.m. she stood up quietly, walked out of the bedroom, and didn't come back. I didn't follow. Because for the first time since I'd woken up in that hospital room, I finally understood something clearly. I wasn't losing her. The morning after she left the bedroom, I woke up to a house that didn't recognize me anymore. Not in some dramatic way. No shattered glass, no overturned furniture. Just quiet. The kind that feels staged, like a model home built to impress people who don't live there. Her side of the closet was empty. Not completely, not enough to look rushed. The hangers were still evenly spaced, but the clothes themselves were gone. Shoes missing from the rack, jewelry box open, its velvet trays staring back at me like exposed bone. She'd packed with care. That hurt more than if she'd fled. I made coffee out of habit, then realized halfway through that I no longer knew how she liked it. Not because I'd forgotten, but because it suddenly felt like a useless detail from someone else's life. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. 42 missed calls was the headline, but the real story was in the voicemails. The first few were clipped, irritated, impatient. The kind of tone people use when they still believe the situation is temporary. By the 10th message, the edges had started to fray. By the 20th, she was bargaining. By the 30th, she wasn't pretending anymore. She never admitted anything directly. That was what struck me most. Not once did she say, "I'm sorry for what I did." Not once did she use words like steal or wrong or illegal. Instead, she kept circling the same idea in different disguises. "You're taking this too far. We can fix this quietly. Why do you want to ruin us?" As if the only damage that mattered was the kind that could be seen from the outside. Around noon, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. A calm voice introduced herself as my wife's attorney. She'd like to discuss resolving this matter without further escalation, the woman said. I almost laughed, without further escalation. Like this was a disagreement about lawn boundaries instead of a dismantling of trust that had taken place while I was unconscious on an operating table. "Tell her to read the report," I said. "It already explains everything." The lawyer paused, then thanked me for my time in the professional way people do when they don't want to reveal what they're really thinking. That afternoon, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. The living room still had the throw pillows she insisted on fluffing every morning. The bookshelf still leaned slightly to the left because she'd refused to let me fix it properly. Our wedding photo still hung in the hallway, the two of us frozen in a moment that now felt like fiction. I took it down. Not angrily, gently. I placed it face down in a drawer, like tucking away a document that no longer applied. In the days that followed, letters started arriving. Not love letters. Not apologies. Notices. Her name appeared on more envelopes than I'd ever seen it on before. Financial institutions acknowledging the freeze. Credit services confirming restrictions. Automated language doing what emotional language never could. closing doors. She came by once while I was out at a physical therapy appointment. I knew because when I returned, the spare room light was on, and one of my desk drawers was slightly open. Nothing missing. Just checked. The visit was a message. I'm still here. I still exist in your space. That night, I changed the locks. The locksmith didn't ask questions. He never does. He just measured, drilled, installed, and left me with a set of keys that felt heavier than metal. A week later, I received an email from the forensic accountant. She'd found more. Not new theft, patterns, months of preparation, testing the limits, adjusting access, practicing invisibility. She'd been rehearsing long before I'd ever scheduled that surgery. I sat there reading it while the late afternoon light stretched across the floor, and for the first time since all this began, I didn't feel angry or sad. I felt clear about what had happened, clear about who I was married to, clear about why I hadn't seen it sooner. That night, I finally replied to one of her messages. Just one sentence. All communication goes through attorneys from now on. No emojis, no softness, no door left open by accident. The reply came almost immediately. A long paragraph, then another, then a missed call. I didn't read any of it, because something in me had shifted from reaction to direction. I wasn't just responding anymore. I was moving forward, not in big gestures, not in courtroom speeches, but in small, irreversible steps that quietly redrew the map of my life. And somewhere in the middle of all that, between changing locks and forwarding mail and printing documents, I realized that the hardest part wasn't losing my wife. It was learning to live in a house that had been telling me the truth for years, and waiting for me to finally listen. 2 weeks after I sent that single sentence, all communication goes through attorneys from now on, the world around me began to feel different. Not calmer, sharper. Like everything had been waiting for permission to stop pretending. The mail changed first. Instead of her glossy subscription magazines and impulsive shopping deliveries, the mailbox filled with thick envelopes stamped with phrases that didn't ask for attention. They demanded it. Final notice. Account restriction. Pending review. I stacked them neatly on the kitchen counter, each one a small marker of distance growing between the life I'd had and the one I was stepping into. My lawyer called on a Tuesday morning. She's contesting the freeze, he said, not unkindly. Claims the funds were moved with your implied consent. Implied. That word always shows up when there's no evidence left to stand on. We prepared. Not theatrically. Quietly. Statements. Authentication logs. Hospital records showing I was under anesthesia at the exact minute the first transfer was authorized. The hearing wasn't held in a grand courtroom. It was a narrow chamber with beige walls and a table scarred by decades of nervous fingers. She sat across from me, a few feet away, but it felt like a different planet. She didn't look at me at first. She studied the wood grain of the table as if it might offer guidance. Her attorney spoke about misunderstandings, about complicated finances, about how marriages blur lines that shouldn't be examined too closely. The words were smooth and careful, like they'd been ironed before being worn. Then my lawyer stood. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. He placed the forensic report on the table and opened it to the timeline. Login from her device, password change, transfer authorization, confirmation email, all while I was unconscious. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. Not tense, settled, like something had been decided before anyone said it out loud. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs.," she began, using my wife's name with deliberate clarity, "can you explain how your husband consented to these actions while he was under anesthesia?" My wife finally looked up. Her eyes met mine for less than a second before dropping again. She said nothing. The judge nodded once. "The freeze stands," she said. "Additionally, the court will consider this evidence in forthcoming proceedings." Just like that, the door didn't just close. It locked. Outside the building, my wife approached me for the first time since everything began. "Please," she said. Her voice was stripped of performance now. It sounded thin, unfamiliar. I didn't think it would go this far. I waited. I was scared, she continued. Things were slipping. I thought I could fix it before you ever knew. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even argue. "You fixed it for yourself," I said, "not for us." She reached for my arm. I stepped back. The gesture wasn't dramatic. It was instinctive. The way you pull your hand away from a flame you finally recognize as heat. That night I opened a new bank account, not to move money, just to exist somewhere untouched. The banker asked me what I wanted to name the account. I paused longer than necessary. Then I said, rebuild. It was a small thing, a label in a system. But as I walked out of the building, debit card warm in my pocket, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not victory, stability. For the first time since waking up in that hospital room, my future wasn't being negotiated in secret rooms or hidden behind screens. It was back where it belonged, with me. After the hearing, people expected me to feel triumphant. They imagined a switch flipping, the bad chapter ending, the good one beginning. But real endings don't work like that. They don't announce themselves. They just stop including certain people, and you don't notice the silence until it has already settled. The house stayed quiet. Not the lonely kind of quiet, the honest kind. No phone ringing from the other room. No irritated sighs over bills. No random laughter at shows I wasn't watching. I began to notice things I had been too distracted to notice before. The way the sunlight moved across the living room wall in the late afternoon. The way the kitchen clock ticked too loudly when nothing else was competing with it. The fact that I liked my coffee stronger than she ever let me make it. I started walking in the mornings. Not for exercise, for grounding. The neighborhood had always been there, but I'd moved through it like a guest in my own life. Now I walked slowly, nodding at people I'd never bothered to meet, noticing gardens I'd passed for years without seeing. There was comfort in the ordinary rhythm of it. Footsteps, birds, traffic in the distance. A reminder that the world doesn't pause just because your marriage collapses. Every few days another letter arrived from my attorney. Updates, next steps, timelines. Nothing dramatic, just the long mechanical process of separating two lives that had once been legally welded together. I stopped opening them right away. I'd set the envelope down, finish whatever I was doing, then read it calmly. It was a strange kind of power, deciding when I would allow certain information into my head. One afternoon I found a box in the garage with her handwriting on the side. Taxes, keep. I almost threw it away without opening it. Instead, I carried it inside, set it on the dining table, and lifted the lid. Inside were folders I hadn't touched in years. Returns, statements, notes in the margins written in her neat looping script. And suddenly I could see the story again. Not the romantic version, but the financial one, where she'd insisted on managing everything. Where I'd been relieved to let her, where convenience had quietly turned into dependency. That night, I scanned the documents and uploaded them to a secure drive I controlled alone. Not because anyone told me to, because I no longer trusted absence of knowledge to be neutral. The following weekend, I repainted the spare room. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. I didn't even have a clear plan. I just stood in the doorway with a roller in my hand, stared at the pale blue walls she'd chosen, and thought, this isn't mine yet. By evening, the room was warm gray, clean, unclaimed. I slept there that night, not because the bedroom hurt, but because it felt important to occupy space that had never belonged to her. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring out. A minute later, a text appeared. I don't know who I am without you. I read it once. Then I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and turned off the light. I wasn't responsible for teaching her who she was. I was finally responsible for deciding who I would be. In the weeks that followed, small habits formed. I cooked differently. I watched different things. I left the radio off in the car just to hear my own thoughts echo for a while. And every so often, usually when I least expected it, I felt a quiet gratitude that I had woken up when I did. Not in the hospital room. In my life. 3 months after the hearing, I signed the final document. No dramatic courtroom scene. No raised voices. Just a pen gliding across paper in a neutral office that smelled faintly of toner and old coffee. The clerk stamped the page, slid it back to me, and said, "You're all set." All set. 2 words that somehow carried the weight of a lifetime. I walked outside and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment longer than necessary. The sky was wide and unremarkable. Cars moved through the intersection as if nothing in the world had changed, but everything had. I didn't go home right away. I drove without a destination, letting the city unravel itself street by street, like I was seeing it for the first time. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, and almost didn't recognize the person staring back. Not because I looked different, because I felt owned by myself again. Later that week, the first reimbursement appeared in my account. Not the full amount. The process would take time, but enough to prove that the freeze hadn't been a symbolic gesture. It was working. The system that had once been invisible to me was now moving on my behalf, quietly correcting a wrong I'd once been told to ignore. I didn't celebrate. I opened my new account, the one I'd named Rebuild, and transferred the funds there. A clean start deserves clean boundaries. The house changed slowly after that. Not through renovation, but through subtraction. I removed things that carried no warmth anymore. The chairs we never sat in. The art we'd bought because it was expensive, not because it meant anything. One evening, I opened the drawer where I'd hidden our wedding photo months earlier. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. I slid it into an envelope, sealed it, and placed it in a box labeled Archive. Not because I wanted to erase the past, but because it no longer needed to live in the present. A week later, I ran into her at the grocery store. It wasn't dramatic. She stood in the cereal aisle, comparing prices, a basket on her arm instead of the cart she used to fill without checking totals. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way people do when the world has stopped rearranging itself around them. She noticed me at the same time I noticed her. We didn't move. For a moment, all the conversations we'd never had seemed to hang between us like a question neither of us could answer anymore. "I never meant for it to end like this," she said finally. I nodded. "I know. It wasn't forgiveness, it was closure." I paid for my groceries and walked out into the evening, the automatic doors sliding open like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the streetlights come on one by one. No notifications, no missed calls, just the quiet knowledge that the future I was building now was one she would never be able to touch. Not with passwords, not with excuses, not with carefully chosen words, because trust, once broken, doesn't get repaired, it gets replaced. And mine now belonged entirely to me.